Have you ever noticed that there are people who don't post anything, but seem to have a peace that the whole world is looking for? While everyone rushes to show off what they have, what they do, and how they feel, they simply disappear from the shop window. And the curious thing is that the less they show themselves, the more presence they seem to have. Psychology explains this, and Carl Jung was one of the first to predict what is happening now. We live in an era where the ego needs to be seen to feel alive. But some people have begun to awaken from this collective trance. They have understood that spirituality is not about sharing light, but about caring for one's own shadow. That true self-care is not about posting pretty phrases, but about knowing when to be silent. What these people have discovered is something few dare to admit. Silence today is a form of power. While the world seeks applause, they seek authenticity. While everyone wants to be remembered, they want to be present. And perhaps, just perhaps, they are the only ones who are truly awake. The modern world has transformed into a grand stage where the ego finds nourishment in every like, and the shadow hides behind carefully chosen filters and captions. Amidst this avalanche of images and opinions, a silent paradox emerges. The more people show, the less they truly reveal. Carl Jung would say that we live trapped in an unconscious dance between the persona and the self, trying to balance the need for belonging with the fear of real exposure. Modern psychology confirms what ancestral spirituality already knew. The gaze of the other is a subtle drug. It addicts, molds, and imprisons. Posting has become an almost automatic ritual, a way to seek meaning amidst the noise. And paradoxically, the more we show ourselves, the more we lose ourselves. It's curious to observe how many confuse visibility with value, believing they only exist if they are seen. But the soul, that silent witness to everything, doesn't need spotlights. It only wants presence, not approval. And at this point, the conflict between the inner and digital worlds begins. Those who live for digital appearances feel, even silently, the exhaustion of maintaining an edited version of themselves. It's as if the ego is in constant performance, trying to convince everyone and itself that it's okay. Jung would call this ego inflation, the moment when the mask becomes more important than the face. And this phenomenon doesn't only happen to celebrities or influencers, but to anyone who, without realizing it, exchanges the mirror of the soul for the reflection of the screen. Spirituality teaches that excessive exposure steals vital energy, because every time we show too much, we surrender a piece of our inner strength to the judgment of others. And when the external gaze becomes the thermometer of self-esteem, authenticity begins to wither. Self-care then is no longer about resting, but about performing rest. Even vulnerability has become content. It's a painful paradox. Everyone wants to be real, but almost no one wants to be forgotten. However, a silent movement is growing beneath this illuminated stage. People who choose digital silence, conscious pause, and the reclaiming of their own souls. They don't seek to disappear, only to reappear within themselves. While the world chases after relevance, these souls walk towards the essential. They understand that spirituality is detachment, and that there is no healing without shadow, without confronting one's own emptiness. Stopping posting isn't disappearing, it's rediscovering oneself. It's an act of radical self-care, a way of saying, I exist even when no one is watching. The paradox of exposure is that the more we show, the less we feel, and the less we show, the more we find ourselves. Digital silence isn't absence, it's presence in its purest form. And perhaps in this void of noise, the first sign of authenticity is born. But can people sustain this silence for long without feeling the weight of judgment? When someone decides not to post, the gesture seems simple, but within it lies an entire universe of psychological meanings. Carl Jung would explain this behavior as a movement of individuation, the soul seeking to free itself from the masks imposed by the collective ego. The absence of posts, at its core, is a way of saying, I don't need to be seen to exist. It's the unconscious trying to reclaim space in a mind saturated with external stimuli. Psychology teaches that every human act has a symbolic root, and digital silence is one of them. It represents the attempt to re-establish the balance between being and seeming, between the soul and the algorithm. In times when everyone shouts, remaining silent is a profoundly spiritual gesture. It's as if the individual was saying, I prefer to listen to myself than to be interpreted. This choice reveals a rare type of self-care, that of protecting one's own energy from overexposure. And those who have made this choice know silence speaks volumes. Those who distance themselves from social media aren't necessarily fleeing the world, but rather the fragmentation that the digital world provokes. Psychology calls this social comparison fatigue, the weariness of measuring oneself against ever-changing standards. And this weariness isn't superficial, it reaches the unconscious, feeding the shadow, distorting the ego, and sabotaging authenticity. Carl Jung said that what we deny in ourselves doesn't disappear, it only gains strength in the dark. The same happens online. The more we show, the more we hide what we truly feel. Not posting is therefore a refusal to falsify one's own identity. It's an inner dive, a gesture of spirituality amidst superficiality. The individual who understands this doesn't need to prove anything. They realize that true value lies not in how many people follow them, but in how many truths they can uphold without needing applause. And the most interesting thing is that this behavior, often seen as disinterest, is actually a sign of advanced self-awareness. The person who doesn't post frequently is, consciously or not, practicing emotional self-regulation. They learn to observe the impulse to share and choose when they do it for connection and when they do it out of need. This pause is where spiritual discernment is born. Jung called this the integration process, when the ego begins to dialogue with the shadow and choose with maturity what really matters to show. Digital silence in this sense is not withdrawal, it is mastery. It is when spirituality meets psychology and transforms the simple act of not posting into an exercise of presence and authenticity. But this awareness is still rare because it requires courage to face the void that arises when the gaze of the other disappears. And it is in this void that the next stage is revealed: resistance. Refusing to expose everything is almost a revolutionary act in a world driven by validation. Not posting has become, in a way, a silent cry against modern conditioning. Carl Jung said that true freedom is born when the individual differentiates themselves from the collective unconscious. And the collective unconscious today is in the form of a feed. Resisting it is refusing the invisible script that we need to be interesting all the time. Spirituality understands this as a return to presence. The person who constantly refrains from sharing is, even unknowingly, training the ego to detach itself from applause and the shadow to stop controlling the narrative. It's not about rejecting technology, but about using consciousness to avoid being used by it. This resistance is silent but powerful. It manifests when someone experiences a profound moment and decides to keep it, not out of fear, but out of love for what is real. It is self-care transformed into rebellion. The act of not posting is, psychologically, a break from the norm. It's when the individual chooses authenticity over performance, a pause over exposure. Jung would say that this gesture symbolizes the birth of a new relationship with one's own ego, one in which the self no longer needs to be a product. When someone understands that the gaze of others does not define their existence, they recover vital energy, focus, and clarity. It's like giving up running a marathon that leads nowhere. And the curious thing is that this silent choice has concrete effects. It improves concentration, reduces anxiety, and restores the ability to feel pleasure in small things. Spirituality calls this energetic realignment. Psychology calls it emotional regulation. The result is the same, presence. And perhaps for the first time, the person can see the world without the filter of comparison, seeing life for what it is, not for what it seems. Resisting exposure isn't about hiding. It's about choosing the sacred. Digital silence functions as a modern retreat. It's not escape, it's purification. Just as monks isolate themselves to listen to their own spirit, the individual who distances themselves from social media is, in a way, practicing a type of invisible meditation. Carl Jung stated that what we resist persists. But here the resistance is different. It's conscious, intentional, mature. It's a resistance that heals. It doesn't stem from fear, but from the clarity of someone who realizes that excessive noise kills the soul. When a person stops posting, they rediscover something that has always been there, the pleasure of existing without an audience. And this form of freedom is contagious because it inspires others to also rethink what they are doing with their energy, their time, and their minds. After all, when exposure ceases to be the rule, the value of silence becomes revolution. And it is precisely in this silence that the next step is born, privacy as power. In a time when everything is shared, preserving privacy has become an act of emotional intelligence. Carl Jung explained that the unconscious needs dark spaces to reorganize itself, and these spaces are destroyed when everything is exposed. Privacy, then, is the territory of the soul. It is where spirituality finds refuge and the ego learns to quiet down. When someone decides not to show every detail of their life, they are unconsciously practicing self-care. They are protecting their own energy from the invasive gaze of the world. And the gaze of the world, we know, is heavy. It interprets, distorts, judges. Psychology shows that constant exposure increases anxiety and self-criticism because the brain begins to seek patterns of approval all the time. Protecting oneself is not about being mysterious, it's about being conscious. It's like learning to close the window when the wind is too cold. A simple gesture, but full of silent wisdom. Privacy is the antidote to dispersion. When the mind is too open to the gaze of others, the ego fragments and loses its axis. Jung said that modern man suffers from overexposure of consciousness. That is, he thinks too much about what the world expects of him and feels too little of what he truly is. The result is an emptiness disguised as success. Spirituality, on the other hand, invites us to return to the center. It teaches that energy is strengthened in silence and dissipates in exhibitionism. This is why the most authentic people always seem to have an air of mystery. They don't show everything because they know that the invisible is what sustains the visible. Self-care here is energetic, filtering what is shared, limiting access, choosing with whom one opens up. It's not about hiding, but about selecting. Psychology calls this healthy boundaries. The soul calls it peace. Protecting one's own privacy is fundamentally protecting one's own time. It's understanding that not every experience needs validation, that not every emotion needs explanation. Authenticity is born when a person realizes they can be whole, even in silence. Carl Jung saw this as the path to individuation, becoming who one is without depending on the image others project. It's curious how people confuse privacy with solitude, when in reality it's the basis of inner freedom. Those who learn to be with themselves discover a kind of strength that doesn't need witnesses. It's the opposite of spiritual vanity, where being becomes more important than seeming. And when someone reaches this point, something changes profoundly. The gaze turns inward, and the noise of the world no longer has so much power. This silent peace is the prelude to real self-confidence, the kind that doesn't shout, it simply exists. True self-confidence doesn't need a stage. It manifests in the serenity of someone who no longer feels the urgency to prove anything. Carl Jung stated that when the ego harmonizes with the shadow, a kind of silent power is born, one that doesn't need applause because it has already found approval within itself. And this inner strength is rare, because the modern world teaches the opposite: show to be seen, speak to be remembered. But the soul doesn't follow this logic. Spirituality understands that someone's value is not in how often they appear, but in the intensity of the presence they offer. The most authentic people are precisely those who don't need to show off. They walk in silence, with the kind of security that doesn't depend on the reflection on a screen. Psychology calls this intrinsic self-esteem, a sense of worth that comes from within and is not shaken by external tides. And it is at this point that self-care gains a new dimension. It ceases to be a ritual and becomes identity. Silent self-confidence is built in layers, in the coexistence between the ego and vulnerability. Jung saw the ego not as an enemy, but as an instrument. It should serve the self, not command it. When someone understands this, they stop fighting against themselves. They accept that there are days of light and days of shadow, and that both are part of the same growth process. Spirituality reinforces this balance when it teaches that real power is the power of the center, the place where noise doesn't reach. And curiously, this type of confidence isn't shown, it's felt. It's in the tranquil gaze, in the voice that doesn't need to impose itself, in the gesture that doesn't seek recognition. It's the kind of strength that is only perceived when silence enters the room. And the more a person connects with this inner state, the less they need external validation. Self-care then ceases to be doing something for oneself and becomes being at peace with oneself. This discreet confidence also changes how someone relates to the digital world. Those who feel whole don't need to show off to exist. Social networks cease to be a mirror and become merely a tool. And that is liberating. The person begins to share what they want, not what they think they should. They don't fear being forgotten because they have already found themselves. Carl Jung said that self-awareness transforms the gaze, and when the gaze changes, everything changes. This self-confidence is not arrogance, it is mature humility. It is knowing that the value of a life is not in being seen, but in being lived authentically. The ego becomes an ally, the shadow ceases to be an enemy, and spirituality manifests in simple gestures, listening more, speaking less, living from the inside out. And in the silence of this inner strength, something begins to blossom, an emotional self-care so profound that it transforms even the way a person breathes. From this center arises the next point: emotional balance in a world that never stops. We live in an era where noise is constant. Notifications, opinions, comparisons, stimuli. Everything seems urgent, everything seems important. The saturated mind barely finds space to breathe, and that's when self-care ceases to be a luxury and becomes survival. Carl Jung said that modern man suffers because he has lost contact with his own unconscious, and excessive digital connection is one of the clearest symptoms of this. Spirituality teaches the opposite of the rhythm of social media. It invites silence, pause, listening. The ego wants speed, the soul wants depth. The problem is that often we confuse online presence with real presence. Psychology shows that constant exposure activates the same reward system as chemical addictions, and little by little we exchange feeling for reacting. That's why emotional self-care needs to be radical. Turning off the cell phone, meditating, walking alone, writing without posting. These are small internal revolutions that rebalance the soul. Caring for the mind in a hyper-connected world is like trying to keep a candle lit in the middle of a gale. It's necessary to create shelters, rituals of silence, invisible boundaries, intentional pauses. Spirituality calls this a ritual of recollection. Jung would call it ego integration, because the ego, when overexposed, becomes inflamed. It begins to seek meaning in metrics, and the emptiness grows proportionally to the numbers. Self-care then becomes the exercise of remembering who you are when no one is watching. It can be something simple, waking up and taking a deep breath before touching your phone, reading a passage from a book that nourishes the soul, perhaps Man and His Symbols by Carl Jung, or The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. The important thing is to create space for the invisible to act. Authenticity flourishes in that interval between stimulus and response. And it is there, in that second of silence, that emotional self-care truly happens. Modern psychology confirms what ancient wisdom has always known. Overstimulation leads to a lack of self. When everything is connected, the risk is disconnecting from within. And it is at this point that self-care transcends the idea of well-being and becomes a form of living spirituality. It is the reconciliation between the ego and the shadow, between what we show and what we hide. It is the moment when we choose to listen to ourselves before reacting, to calm ourselves before explaining, to feel before posting. Self-care is the courage to be alone without feeling lonely. It is the maturity to prioritize silence without feeling forgotten. When someone understands this, something changes. The mind slows down, the body breathes, and the soul aligns. Hyperconnection loses its power because the person has learned the secret that few know. The most important connection is the one that happens within. And it is precisely from this internal reconciliation that the next level is born. Authenticity as a form of freedom. Being authentic in today's world is almost an act of spiritual rebellion. While most rush to fit into patterns of acceptance, the authentic person prefers to walk alone, in silence, faithful to their own truth. Carl Jung said that individuation is the most solitary and liberating process of existence, the moment when the human being ceases to live as a reflection of the collective and begins to live as an expression of the self. Spirituality understands this journey as a return to essence, the point where the ego ceases to command and begins to serve. And that is why authenticity is frightening. It does not seek approval, it demands presence. When someone shows themselves as they truly are, without filters, without narrative, without the need to please, it provokes discomfort in those who still live trapped in the persona. Psychology calls this deconditioning. Jung called it awakening. It is the moment when the individual stops asking permission to exist. But authenticity isn't just pretty talk, it's daily practice. It's saying no when the world expects you to agree. It's maintaining silence when everyone is talking. It's choosing self-care even when it seems selfish. Spirituality teaches that every time we betray ourselves to please someone, the soul shrinks a little. The shadow grows as the ego tries to appear as something it is not. Being authentic is looking at the shadow, embracing it and integrating it without guilt. It's accepting that being true isn't always about being understood. Jung stated that the greatest tragedy in life is becoming what others expect. Authenticity heals this tragedy. It restores the power of choice, rescues spontaneity, and creates a kind of freedom that doesn't depend on any setting. Someone who is authentic can change cities, professions, or social roles and still remain whole, because it's not the environment that defines who they are, but the consciousness they carry within. To live authentically is to break free from the tyranny of image. It is to allow spirituality to manifest in the simplest way, being true in every gesture. Psychology shows that authentic people experience less social anxiety and greater satisfaction with their lives because the ego ceases to be at war with itself. They understand that the purpose is not to impress, but to express. And the more they express who they truly are, the more life begins to flow naturally. Self-care, at this level, is choosing what is coherent, even if it is unpopular. It is allowing oneself to err, to feel, to backtrack, without needing to justify. Carl Jung saw this as a sign of spiritual maturity, the reconciliation between light and shadow, because when a person fully accepts themselves, the judgment of others loses its power, and it is precisely from this state of inner freedom that the final point is born, the power to consciously choose one's own way of existing, real presence. The rarest freedom that exists is the freedom to consciously choose one's own way of existing. Carl Jung said that most people don't live, they are lived. And this phrase summarizes the challenge of the digital age. Most people react to stimuli, liking, commenting, sharing, without realizing they are being shaped by invisible forces. Choosing silence, a pause, a moment, is to break free from this collective hypnosis. It is to recover the power to decide when the ego should express itself and when it should be silent. Spirituality calls this presence, psychology, self-regulation. Both point to the same path, that of consciousness. When someone decides not to post, not to expose themselves, not to participate in the noise, they are making a profound spiritual choice. They are saying, I prefer to be than to seem. And that is rare. The modern world confuses movement with purpose, speech with wisdom, visibility with value. But the soul knows. What is real doesn't need an audience. Real presence is a constant exercise. It demands attention, humility, and above all, courage to face the discomfort of the present moment. Carl Jung explained that the unconscious pushes us toward distraction when we don't want to look inward. That's why many people live chasing after novelty, to escape themselves. Spirituality, on the contrary, invites us to remain, to be there, whole, even when the mind wants to escape. The ego resists, wants to control, wants to be seen. But the self, silent, simply observes. The psychology of mindfulness describes this state as full attention, the space where the shadow loses power because it is illuminated by consciousness. Self-care here is not reacting to everything. It's breathing before responding. It's understanding that you don't need to have an opinion on everything to be someone. It's the kind of emotional maturity that gives peace instead of reason and serenity instead of applause. Choosing true presence means deciding to live with radical authenticity. It's realizing that each moment contains everything you've ever sought. That happiness isn't in likes, but in the awareness of being alive. Carl Jung saw this as the apex of the individuation process, the moment when a human being stops seeking meaning outside and begins to create it within. Spirituality translates this into a simple image, the return to the center. When someone reaches this point, the external world loses the power to dictate the internal rhythm. The ego becomes a messenger, not a tyrant. The shadow, an ally, not a threat. Psychology teaches that true maturity is acting by choice, not by impulse. And it is in this state of lucidity that true freedom is born. Because in the end, living with presence is the greatest power that exists. The power to be whole, even in silence, even when no one is watching. And it is in this conscious silence that the journey truly begins. In the end, perhaps the question isn't why some people don't post, but why we still need to be seen so much. Carl Jung said that what we fear most within ourselves is precisely what can set us free. And perhaps that's what digital silence is, the mirror where we finally see ourselves without filters. When was the last time you experienced something and kept it all to yourself? When was the last time a moment was so real that you didn't even think about filming it? True spirituality begins at that moment, when the ego falls silent and the soul finally breathes. Psychology calls it integration, life calls it peace. So if something within you has just awakened, if this video has made you rethink the way you've been living, use this as a turning point. You don't need to change everything today. Just start by observing what motivates you to post and what you're trying to prove. Authenticity is born from this awareness. If this content resonated with you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way you can continue learning about spirituality, psychology, and the power of truly knowing yourself. And remember, silence is not absence. It is presence in its purest form.